In the winter of 1400, England's king vanished from sight. No royal processions, no council meetings, no word from the throne. Then whispers began. The king was alive, but locked away in a cold, dark cell, a prisoner of his own cousin. Once draped in gold, Richard II now lay starving on a filthy floor, the crown ripped from his head, his voice silenced forever. But how did a monarch, chosen by God, end up reduced to a nameless corpse in the royal records? This is not just a story of a fall from grace. It is the slow, deliberate murder of a king hidden in plain sight. The cell was silent. No chains rattled, no footsteps echoed. Somewhere, far above, a winter storm clawed at the castle walls. Inside, the man once called Your Majesty lay still, the cold creeping into his bones. But before we reach this moment, before the starvation, the betrayal, the darkness, we need to understand how Richard II's life began, because his end was already written in his childhood. Richard was born on January 6, 1367, in the royal palace of Bordeaux, a prince of the House of Plantagenet, the second son of Edward, the Black Prince, heir to the English throne. His birth should have been a blessing, but his earliest years unfolded under a gathering storm. England was locked in the 100 Years' War with France, and the Black Death still lingered in whispers across Europe. The boy grew up in a world where kings were judged not by kindness, but by power. When Richard was just 3 years old, his family's destiny shifted. His elder brother, Edward of Angoulême, died suddenly. The official cause listed as illness, though rumors hinted at darker possibilities. From that moment, the toddler Richard became heir to one of the most powerful crowns in Christendom. But the shadow of tragedy grew longer. His father, the Black Prince, was England's greatest warrior. Yet disease and exhaustion from endless campaigns left him a broken man. By the time Richard was 6, his father was too weak to stand in battle armor, his once mighty frame collapsing under sickness. In June 1376, the Black Prince died. The grief was still raw when, a year later, King Edward III followed him to the grave. England now had a king, but he was just a boy. Richard II was crowned in Westminster Abbey in July 1377, only 10 years old. Picture it. The golden crown far too large for his head, the weight of it pressing down like a prophecy. The cheering crowd saw a young prince destined for greatness. What they could not see was the danger that always stalks a child ruler, the hungry wolves waiting to seize a throne for themselves. The early years of Richard's reign were governed by regents, powerful nobles and family members who ruled in his name. Foremost among them was his uncle, John of Gaunt, a man whose ambition was legendary. Officially, Gaunt claimed loyalty to his nephew. But in the shadows, England's court was a nest of rivalries, each lord weighing how far they could push their influence before the boy king would push back. And then came the spark, the one event that would scar Richard for life, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. It began in the south of England, where heavy taxation to fund the endless war with France had pushed the poor to breaking point. A poll tax, the same amount demanded from rich and poor alike, became the final insult. Villages erupted in anger, armed with pitchforks and whatever they could find. Thousands marched toward London. By June, the rebels stood at the gates of the capital. London's defenses crumbled as sympathetic townsfolk let them in. The city burned with fury. Prisons smashed open, tax records destroyed, the homes of royal officials torched. The king's advisors urged him to flee, to hide, to wait it out. But Richard was only 14, and he did something unexpected. He rode out to meet them. Imagine the scene. A boy in gleaming armor, barely a teenager, riding a white horse into a sea of angry faces. Eyewitnesses recorded that the mob fell silent as the young king spoke. Richard promised reforms, offered pardons, and, for a moment, seemed to win their trust. But this fragile peace shattered days later when their leader, Wat Tyler, was killed in a sudden clash with royal forces. In that instant, the illusion was gone. Richard ordered the rebels to disperse, declaring with icy certainty, "You shall have no captain but me." The revolt was crushed, and thousands were executed in the months that followed. This was a turning point. The boy king had tasted both the thrill of command and the sting of betrayal. The memory of standing alone before an army would stay with him. But so would a lesson. Mercy was a weakness. Promises were made to be broken, and power must be defended at any cost. In the years that followed, Richard began to rule less like a child and more like an absolute monarch. Yet the very nobles who had once guided him now began to whisper that the young king was arrogant, unpredictable, dangerous. And in the royal court of medieval England, whispers could kill as surely as swords. The year was 1400. Outside the thick stone walls of Pontefract Castle, the land lay frozen under a bitter January wind. But inside, the cold was worse. Not the kind that nipped at your fingers, but the kind that seeped into your bones, into your will, into the last threads of a man's dignity. Somewhere in the dark belly of that fortress, Richard II, King of England by divine right, sat alone. No crown, no sword, no allies. The man who once commanded thousands now commanded nothing, not even a right to speak to the outside world. Days blurred into nights. The cell was damp, the air stale. Rats moved with more freedom than the king himself. Food was scarce, waterfowl. He had been reduced to rags, his face pale and drawn, the fine lines of royalty replaced by the hollow marks of hunger. But to understand how Richard came to this, locked away, a king in name only, we must go back to a boy whose life was shaped by a crown he was too young to bear, and a realm too fractured to be ruled by innocence. A crown for a child. Richard was just 10 years old when he became king in 1377. His grandfather, Edward III, was dead. His father, the Black Prince, England's great warrior, had already been taken by illness. And so, with a gold circlet resting awkwardly on his small head, Richard ascended to the throne of a kingdom at war with France, riddled with political rivalries, and simmering with unrest at home. At first, he was shielded from the weight of kingship by councils and regents. But England was not a patient country. The young monarch was expected to embody strength, wisdom, and authority, virtues no 10-year-old could truly possess. And then came 1381, the Peasants' Revolt, baptism by fire. The uprising began in the countryside, sparked by crushing taxes and resentment toward corrupt officials. It swept toward London like a wildfire, tens of thousands of rebels pouring into the city. Richard, only 14 at the time, did something few expected. He met them, riding out to Mile End. He faced a sea of angry faces and promised reforms, a better future, and an end to their grievances. It was a moment of unexpected courage. And for a brief, shining hour, the boy king seemed every inch the leader England needed. But politics is a cruel tutor. That promise of reform, it was quickly broken. The rebellion was crushed with merciless violence. Thousands were executed. The people learned that the crown could smile one day and bare its teeth the next. Richard learned, too, that mercy in politics is often seen as weakness, and weakness is a death sentence. The making of an autocrat. In the years that followed, Richard began to change. No longer the naive boy who would face a mob. He grew into a ruler who demanded obedience and punished dissent. The Parliament and the nobles, many of whom believed themselves superior to the king in wisdom and birthright, found themselves increasingly at odds with his rule. Richard believed in the divine right of kings, that God himself had placed him on the throne. But England's nobles believed in their own right to control the crown. It was an old conflict, but under Richard, it began to smolder dangerously. In 1387, the tension exploded. A group of powerful nobles, the Lords Appellant, accused Richard's closest allies of treason. Armies clashed. The king's faction lost. Richard, humiliated, was forced into submission. His friends and advisers were executed before his eyes. It was a lesson written in blood. Never again would he allow his power to be stripped away. A dangerous memory. But kings remember. And Richard was not a man to forgive. By 1397, his fortunes had reversed. The king moved swiftly, arresting the Lords Appellant and executing or exiling them. He ruled with a tightened fist, surrounding himself with loyalists and silencing any who dared oppose him. For a while, his authority seemed unshakable. Then came the fatal miscalculation, the exile of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the cousin in the shadows. Henry was no ordinary cousin. He was a son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, one of the most powerful men in England. In 1398, Richard banished Henry after a dispute with another noble. The sentence was supposed to be 10 years, but when John of Gaunt died the following year, Richard extended Henry's exile and seized his vast inheritance for the crown. It was an act that would come back like a knife in the dark. Because Henry Bolingbroke was not a man to vanish quietly, Richard's reign had begun in 1377, when he was just 10 years old. The coronation was a spectacle, a glittering ceremony in Westminster Abbey, with trumpets blaring and incense drifting through the vaulted air. Yet beneath the gold-threaded robes and jewel crown sat a boy whose feet barely touched the floor of the throne. England in that moment was not a land of peace. The 100 Years' War still burned against France, draining coffers and bleeding soldiers. Taxation was high. Discontent simmered among peasants, merchants, and even the nobility. The real power lay not in the young king's hands, but in those of his council and his ambitious uncles, especially John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Richard was a child learning to rule in a world of wolves. Only 4 years later, in 1381, the simmering discontent boiled over into one of the most dangerous uprisings England had ever seen. The Peasants' Revolt. Tens of thousands of rebels, armed with farm tools, bows, and fury, marched toward London, burning manorial records and killing officials who had enforced the hated poll tax. They demanded the end of serfdom and the execution of corrupt ministers. The capital teetered on the brink of chaos. Nobles and courtiers panicked, some fleeing for their lives. The boy king, barely 15, was thrust into a situation that would have unnerved seasoned monarchs. And yet, against the advice of many, Richard rode out to meet the rebels face to face. The meeting at Mile End was tense. A sea of angry faces and rough voices, the smell of sweat and smoke in the summer air. Richard's voice, still high with youth, called for peace. He promised reforms, charters of freedom, and fairer laws. The crowd roared in approval. For a brief moment, it seemed the crisis might end without bloodshed. But the following day, everything changed. At Smithfield, negotiations broke down. William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, stabbed rebel leader Wat Tyler during a confrontation. Chaos erupted. Rebels drew weapons. Guards rushed in. And in the chaos, young Richard made a decision that would define him. He rode directly into the mob. "Will you kill your king? I am your captain. Follow me," he shouted, commanding them to disperse. Amazingly, they obeyed. The rebellion collapsed soon after, crushed with brutal efficiency. Richard returned to the city a hero in the eyes of some, and a dangerous unknown in the eyes of others. But here was the problem. That early taste of triumph planted a seed in Richard's mind. He had stood unflinching before tens of thousands and bent them to his will. From that day forward, Richard began to believe in something dangerous for a medieval king, that he was not just chosen by inheritance, but by destiny itself. The next decade of his reign would be a constant struggle between the crown and the magnates who believed the king should be guided or controlled by them. Richard, however, saw himself as a supreme authority, answerable to no mortal man. Tensions with his nobles reached a breaking point in 1387. The Lords Appellant, a group of powerful aristocrats, including his own Uncle Thomas of Woodstock, accused Richard's closest allies of treason. What followed was a merciless parliament, a purge in which several of Richard's friends and advisors were executed or exiled. Humiliated and stripped of his inner circle, Richard was forced to submit, for now. But inside, resentment festered. The boy who had once charmed an angry mob was growing into a man who never forgave and never forgot. By the 1390s, Richard had recovered enough power to strike back. He exiled two of his most vocal opponents, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. Officially, it was to prevent their quarrel from spilling into civil war. In reality, it was a move to weaken potential threats to his throne. When John of Gaunt died in 1399, Richard made his fatal mistake. Instead of allowing Henry Bolingbroke to inherit his father's vast estates, as custom dictated, Richard seized them for himself. It was an act that enraged not just Henry, but much of the nobility. The message was clear. No title, no fortune, no life was safe in the king's will. Richard left for Ireland soon after, thinking England secure in his absence. But Henry saw his chance. He landed in Yorkshire with a small force, claiming he only sought to reclaim his inheritance. By the time Richard returned, Henry had gathered enough support to challenge the throne itself. Richard's coronation was unlike anything England had seen in living memory. On July 16, 1377, the streets of London erupted in a carnival of color, banners snapping in the summer wind, church bells ringing so loudly they seemed to shake the city's very bones. The boy who would be king was just 10 years old, his frame small inside the voluminous Rhodes estate, but every eye followed him as he processed toward Westminster Abbey. This was more than a ceremony. It was a performance of power, designed to reassure a kingdom rattled by war and economic unrest. Edward III's reign had ended in decline. The 100 Years was dragging on, and plague still haunted the land. The new monarch's innocence became a canvas onto which the people projected their hopes. Inside the abbey, the air was heavy with incense. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting shards of red and gold across the stone floor. Richard knelt before the altar, his head bowed, as the Archbishop of Canterbury prepared to anoint him. The oil, drawn from a sacred ampulla said to have been delivered by the Virgin Mary herself, was meant to mark him as God's chosen. The choir's voices swelled, echoing up into the vaulted ceilings as the crown, heavy with jewels, history, and expectation, was lowered onto the boy's head. Yet, for all the solemnity, there was an undercurrent of unease. Behind the smiling faces of the nobility, calculations were already being made. A child king was a gift to ambitious lords, pliable, easily influenced, and dependent on the counsel of those around him. For now, the reins of government would remain in the hands of a council dominated by his uncles, the most powerful of whom was John of Gaunt. Richard's mother, Joan of Kent, watched closely, her protective instincts sharpened by the dangers of court life. She had lived through enough intrigue to know how quickly loyalty could turn to betrayal. She would act as a buffer between her son and the sharper edges of politics, but she could not be everywhere. The boy himself seemed blissfully unaware of the shadows stretching toward him. At the coronation banquet, he sat at the head of a vast table groaning under the weight of roasted meats, spiced wines, and sugared fruits. Minstrels played, dancers spun in jewel-toned silks, and the city celebrated as though England's troubles had been banished overnight. But the world beyond the feast hall was restless. Taxes to fund the war in France were squeezing the poor into desperation. The Black Death had left deep economic scars, and resentment simmered in the villages. In those same summer months, murmurs of rebellion began to stir, murmurs that would grow into something far more dangerous. For Richard, the early years of his reign were spent in the careful choreography of royal appearances. He was paraded through towns, his image painted as a youthful, divinely appointed ruler. Chroniclers wrote of his grace, his elegance, and his love for pageantry. But behind the polished facade, the machinery of the realm was grinding toward a crisis that would test not just his kingship, but the very stability of England itself. Because in less than 4 years, the boy crowned in gold and celebrated by the masses would stand face to face with an army of his own people, not in defense of the realm, but in defiance of his rule. And in that moment, Richard would have to decide what kind of king he truly was to be. 1381. England was a pressure cooker ready to explode. The war in France dragged on like an open wound, swallowing men and gold with no victory in sight. Parliament, desperate to fund the failing campaign, turned to the one source they could still squeeze, the common people. It was called the poll tax, and it was as cruel in practice as it was in theory. Unlike traditional taxes that scale with wealth, the poll tax demanded the exact same sum from every adult, rich or poor. For the wealthy, it was little more than pocket change. For peasants barely surviving on thin harvests and meager wages, it was a knife to the throat. This was the third poll tax in just 4 years, and it came with brutal new enforcement. Tax collectors, armed with legal authority and flanked by soldiers, swept through villages demanding payment. If a household claimed its members were too young to pay, collectors would order humiliating verification, forcing young women and even girls to be examined to prove their age. The cruelty of these inspections poured oil on an already raging fire. The resentment burned hottest in the southeastern counties, Essex and Kent, where news traveled quickly along river routes and market roads. In early June, the first sparks flew, Villages rose up, driving out or killing tax collectors. Armed with nothing more than farm tools, cudgels, and the conviction that they had nothing left to lose, peasants gathered in swelling numbers. Their anger was not random. It was organized. They began marching toward London. At their head emerged a figure who would become a folk legend and a nightmare to the ruling class. Wat Tyler? Little is known for certain about him, but in the summer of 1381, his name carried like a battle cry. Beside him walked a radical priest named John Ball, a man whose sermons cut through centuries of feudal order. Ball preached that all men were created equal, and that the nobility's power was a theft from God's design. When Adam delved in Eve's span, he asked, "Who is then the gentleman?" These were not merely angry farmers anymore. They were a movement, and their demands went beyond taxes. They wanted the end of serfdom, the right to work for wages, and justice for decades of abuse by landlords and the crown. Word of the uprising reached Richard in London when he was just 14. His council, led by John of Gaunt's allies, debated whether to crush the rebels immediately or try to placate them. But the rebellion was not a single mob. It was tens of thousands, marching in waves from every direction. The city gates could not hold them forever. As the rebels drew closer, villages along their route threw open their doors, feeding and sheltering them. Even towns that did not join the march were too afraid to resist. By June 12th, the rebels were camped just outside London. They could see the city's spires in the distance. Inside the Tower of London, Richard stood on the edge of a decision that could define his reign. He was barely a teenager, yet all eyes turned to him. The boy who had been crowned in splendor now faced the grim reality of kingship. Not a stage ceremony, but a living crisis. In the days to come, he would have to ride out and face the people himself. And for the first time in his short life, the crown would not be just a symbol. It would be a shield and perhaps a target. On the morning of June 13th, 1381, the rebels poured into London like a flood, breaking its banks. Gates were thrown open, in some cases willingly, in others under the threat of death. Thousands surged through the streets, their banners fluttering above a sea of grim, determined faces. The city that had once been the jewel of England now rang with shouts, clanging bells, and the splintering of wood as mobs forced their way into homes and warehouses. Their first targets were not random. They sought the symbols and servants of royal oppression. The grand mansion of John of Gaunt, Richard's most powerful uncle, was stormed. The rebels looted what they could carry, smashed the rest, and finally set the place ablaze. The fire rose like a pillar, visible for miles, a signal to every oppressed soul that the old order was burning. The boy king watched from within the Tower of London. 14 years old, hemmed in by frightened nobles and his mother, he was told to stay inside where it was safe. But safety was an illusion. The tower itself was surrounded by the same people who had once called him their sovereign. Their chants carried across the river, demands for justice, for freedom, and for the heads of certain hated officials. Among the rebels' most despised targets was Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, who had been one of the architects of the poll tax. His name was shouted with venom. Beside him, Treasurer Sir Robert Hales was equally reviled. The crowd wanted both of them dead, and no stone walls could hold back that fury forever. On June 14th, Richard made a decision that stunned his council. He would meet the rebels face to face. He ordered a barge to be prepared and sailed downriver to Mile End, where tens of thousands of armed peasants waited. The scene was one of barely contained chaos. Carts, wagons, and hastily built tents scattered across the fields, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. When the young king rode forward, the noise of the crowd fell into a strange, expectant silence. Here was their monarch, a boy in gleaming armor, flanked by knights but unshaken. Richard raised his hand and spoke with a calmness that belied his age. "What will you have of me, good people?" he asked. Their demands spilled forth. The end of serfdom, freedom to work for wages, the right to own land, and a general pardon for all who had risen against their lords. To the astonishment of the rebels and his own counselors, Richard agreed. He promised charters of freedom, legal reforms, and safe conduct for those who had taken part. It was a stunning gamble. Many believed the boy king was buying time, making promises he could not, or would not, keep. But in that moment, his words worked. Tens of thousands began to disperse, believing their king had heard them. Yet not all rebels were satisfied. Wat Tyler and his core followers remained in London, their eyes fixed on deeper changes, and perhaps on the destruction of the monarchy itself. The next day, June 15th, would decide everything. Richard would meet Tyler again, this time at Smithfield, and before the sun set, blood would run in the streets. The morning of June 15th, 1381, was heavy with tension. Word spread across London that the young king would meet Wat Tyler in Smithfield, a broad open space just outside the city walls. It was a dangerous decision. Richard's advisors begged him to stay in the safety of the tower, but he refused. Perhaps it was courage, perhaps the stubborn pride of youth, but the boy believed that his presence could still bring order. By midday, thousands had gathered, a restless ocean of bodies. Armed men stood shoulder to shoulder, some gripping farm tools turned into weapons, others holding stolen swords and pikes. The air was hot, the smell of sweat, leather, and unwashed bodies drifting in waves. Every eye was fixed on the two small groups, the king and his mounted retinue on one side, Wat Tyler and his core rebels on the other. Tyler rode forward confidently, a man who had stared down lords and sheriffs without fear. Accounts vary on what happened next, but all agree the exchange turned sour. Some say Tyler behaved with arrogance, keeping his head covered in the king's presence, speaking with demands rather than pleas. Others claim he reached for his dagger in a moment of heated words. Whatever the truth, it was enough to trigger disaster. William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, stepped forward and struck Tyler with his sword, the blade cutting deep into his neck and head. The rebel leader fell from his horse, wounded but still alive. Panic erupted. As Tyler lay on the ground, struggling royal guards rushed in. One stabbed him through the stomach. Another finished the work with a thrust to the heart. Wat Tyler's body was dragged into a nearby building, where he was beheaded. For a heartbeat, the field teetered on the brink of mass slaughter. The rebel army, thousands strong and armed, saw their leader struck down in full view of the king. The roar that rose from them was unlike anything Richard had heard before, rage, grief, and the promise of vengeance all in one. His small force was outnumbered many times over. In that perilous moment, the 14-year-old king did something that would define his early reign. He spurred his horse forward, alone, toward the furious mob. The boy rode straight into their midst, holding his hand high. "Will you kill your king?" he called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I am your captain now. Follow me." It was a breathtaking gamble, and it worked. The rebels hesitated. Perhaps they saw in him not the architect of their suffering, but a young monarch who would face them without flinching. Perhaps they were simply stunned by his audacity. Slowly, their anger ebbed. Richard led them away from the killing ground, promising again to honor the reforms they had demanded. But even as the mob dispersed, the wheels of betrayal were already turning. The promises made at Mile End and Smithfield would not survive the week. And soon, the boy who had walked unarmed into a sea of enemies would reveal that his courage was matched by cold calculation. For a brief moment after Smithfield, it seemed as if England had been spared a bloodbath. The rebel hosts had scattered, returning to their villages with the king's word as their shield. They carried royal pardons signed in the boy's hand, believing they had won a victory, without burning the kingdom to ash. But Richard II had other plans. 3 days later, the true nature of his promise was revealed. The pardons were declared invalid. The reforms they had agreed to, the end of serfdom, the fixed rents, the amnesty for rebels, were all revoked. Orders went out from Westminster for the arrest of every man who had taken part in the uprising. The crackdown was swift and merciless. Royal commissioners, sheriffs, and loyal lords swept through the countryside like a plague. In Essex and Kent, village greens became gallows yards. Men who only days earlier had stood proudly in the streets of London were dragged from their homes, tied to carts, and hanged without trial. One chronicler wrote that the king showed his teeth, and those who had mistaken his youth for weakness learned their error. Richard personally oversaw executions, sometimes attending in person to make an example of the condemned. The heads of rebel leaders, and even minor agitators, were mounted on spikes above city gates. Wat Tyler's head was displayed on London Bridge, His lifeless eyes staring forever at the city he had tried to seize. The punishments extended beyond death. Families of the executed were fined into ruin, their lands seized, their homes burned. The message was clear. No matter how deep the injustice, no matter how righteous the cause, rebellion against the crown would be answered with annihilation. In the weeks that followed, the countryside grew silent. Fear replaced defiance. Serfs returned to their fields under the same crushing obligations they had risen against. The hope of freedom extinguished for another century. And Richard II, the boy who had faced down an army and lived, began to believe in his own invincibility. The events of 1381 planted in him a dangerous seed, the conviction that he was chosen by God, that the crown was not merely a responsibility but a weapon, and that he alone could decide the fate of his people. But seeds of hubris, once planted, always grow. And for Richard, they would grow into a tree so twisted and poisonous that it would one day strangle his reign. The boy who had once stood trembling before a mob now stood taller, at least in his own mind. The peasants' revolt had not broken him. It had convinced him of something far more dangerous. He had stared down thousands of armed men, and they had obeyed. To Richard II, this was no accident. It was divine proof. He began to speak openly of Rex Pacificus, the king of peace, ordained by God to rule with absolute authority. But Richard's idea of peace was not the absence of conflict. It was the absolute submission of his subjects. His youth and delicate frame no longer made him timid. They made him theatrical. He wore crowns and robes heavier than his shoulders could bear, insisting on elaborate court rituals that forced even his closest nobles to kneel and address him as if he were already halfway to sainthood. In the medieval world, kings were expected to show humility before the great lords of the realm. Richard instead built a bubble of ceremony and reverence, shutting himself away from the muddy realities of politics. While England's finances bled from years of war with France, Richard was commissioning gilded palaces, painted ceilings, and silken banners emblazoned with his personal emblem, the White Hart. His inner circle shifted from seasoned nobles to flatterers and courtiers who fed his self-image. Men like Robert de Vere, a handsome and ambitious favorite, became not just advisors, but near extensions of the king's will. This bred resentment among the old guard of barons who had fought for his grandfather Edward III and expected a say in governing the realm. But Richard did not want partners. He wanted subjects. And when the Lords Appellant, a group of powerful nobles, began questioning his spending and policies, he saw not mere criticism, but treason. To Richard, the lesson of 1381 still burned bright. Defiance could not be tolerated. If he had crushed the commoners, he could crush the nobility too. The king began plotting in silence, surrounding himself with loyal household guards and strengthening the influence of his favorites. Publicly, he still smiled, still spoke of unity. But privately, a list was forming, a list of enemies to be humiliated, broken, or destroyed. Richard's reign was moving into a new phase, one where the pageantry of divine kingship would be backed by a ruthless readiness to act against anyone who stood in his way. And just as in 1381, his enemies would underestimate him. But this time, the stakes were far higher, because the next battle would not be with peasants wielding pitchforks, but with the very men who commanded England's armies. By the late 1380s, Richard II was barely 21 years old, still young, but convinced he was ordained to rule without question. His lavish court life, his reliance on favorites like Robert de Vere, and his growing contempt for the old nobility had pushed the kingdom toward a breaking point. The barons who had once tutored and advised him now whispered that he was a danger to England's stability. 5 of the most powerful lords, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, Henry Bolingbroke, Earl of Derby, and Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham, united against him. They called themselves the Lords Appellant, claiming they acted to protect the realm from corrupt advisors and reckless governance. But in truth, they were challenging Richard's right to rule as he saw fit. In 1387, their alliance turned into open confrontation. The Lords Appellant raised armies and confronted the king's loyalists at the Battle of Radcot Bridge. Richard's forces, led by his beloved Robert de Vere, were crushed. De Vere fled the country in disgrace, and Richard was forced to submit to the will of his enemies. For a year, he was king in name only. Parliament, dominated by the Lords Appellant, executed or exiled his closest allies, stripped him of control over his own household, and humiliated him in front of the realm. It was the lowest point of his reign. Many thought he would never recover. But Richard learned a dangerous lesson in this humiliation. Patience could be a weapon. Publicly, he played the obedient monarch, speaking of reconciliation and unity. Privately, he nursed his resentment, memorizing every insult, every betrayal. He waited, and when Gloucester, Arundel, and Warwick began to relax their guard, convinced they had broken him, Richard moved. In 1389, he declared himself of full age and capable of ruling without regents or guardians. The Lords Appellant, fearing renewed conflict, allowed him to resume his authority. For the next several years, Richard governed more carefully, avoiding direct clashes. He restored England's finances, secured a long truce with France, and rebuilt his image as a cultured diplomatic king. But beneath the surface, the old wounds still festered. Richard had not forgotten Radcot Bridge. He had not forgotten exile, execution, and humiliation. He was only waiting for the right moment to strike back, and when that moment came, he would not simply defeat the Lords Appellant. He would erase them,